I wanted to talk about the different waves of immersive sims that have come out over the years. There seems to be an interesting sort of cycle where maybe every 10 or 15 years there sort of becomes a AAA revival of the immersive sim, and then after a while people seem to think the idea isn't as good as they thought, or maybe people think they're not making as much money as they thought, and they sort of go away again. And I find it sort of interesting that this is the case, but it also means that you have sort of the AAA space developing the games. Then everyone can kind of play their own stuff as they're making it. Sometimes they exchange ideas during that sort of time, and other times it takes them a while to like sort of coalesce and understand the ideas that are sort of coming in. Most recently, I would say that like the bands of time have kind of gotten a little bit more murky, but I think it's in a spot now where there's been at least enough time and enough of these like sort of bands that we can kind of really talk about what's going on and sort of identify the like three waves of immersive sims. So I would say kind of the first wave, if you will, would be like a Thief, System Shock, Deus Ex. Those games really brought sort of this idea of sort of exploring, but also sort of understanding of the genre. They had like, it was very much a developer down sort of understanding. Like you had a sets of people that believed certain things about games, and they were making those games sort of like that. But they weren't necessarily interacting as much with the enthusiast crowd. And in some ways, the fans of these games weren't yet understanding that they liked immersive sims, they just knew they liked these games. What these games were really doing is they were laying down this foundation of like, hey, these are the kind of games. This is like the subgenre, because these are all like first-person shooters, technically. They're all in this subgenre of immersive sim. Once people kind of were able to like see that and then like have some time to play and think and react to like what this was, and essentially also what happened is some of these studios either shut down, moved to different projects, or they kind of stopped doing the immersive sim thing. Once that happened, and there was that time between these sort of releases, that allowed for the sort of next wave to sort of come out. The next wave, I would say the second wave of immersive sim was sort of started with Bioshock, Dishonored, and then sort of the new Deus Ex games, which were made by a different studio. And I think sort of they started to get wrapped up with Prey and Deathloop. I think this is with the very tail end of this second wave, especially when you look at like things like Deathloop, you start seeing things start to bleed into like the third, and spoiler, it's like the third sort of indie wave. But to go back to like what the second wave was really codifying, is they were sort of they were kind of taking this sort of definition and reaction of to what the immersive sim was, and sort of being able to say, based on what we know, this is what we're building. It allowed them to, I think, have sort of a more clear direction of what they were doing, but it also sort of lost some of that amateur quality, and not amateur in the sense of like low production values, but amateur in the sense of like you don't really know what you don't know, and you're discovering things for the first time. There's just sort of like a freshness to the ideas that you bring to the table. I feel like Bioshock and Dishonored, they had some really amazing ideas in there, like the blink ability from a gameplay standpoint basically changed immersive sims. You know, the storytelling in Bioshock, everyone loves it. When you come over to like Prey as well, you really see this hardcore refinement of immersive sim. I guess the weird thing is that because they're sort of reacting to each other and they're building on top of one each other, there starts to become a lot of like sanded off edges that you sort of see in AAA. You start to see some like AAA-ness start to sort of come in. I'd say probably like most notably is Deathloop, because in Deathloop they have tiered loot, which is something I despise. I also understand sort of why you might put that into a game, but I also sort of believe that in an immersive sim, if you have tiered loot, like it's a strange inclusion, because I feel like in an immersive sim you should be creating more tools. Nobody goes to an immersive sim for the looter shooter experience, for the grindy sort of experience. It's not typically what people want. Deathloop, I really kind of consider it sort of the end of this wave, because it was a AAA game. It did do a lot of the AAA things, but it was also the game where Arcane kind of sat down and they were like, okay, like we're gonna really kind of get weird with it. Sort of, some people say it's like they played all the hits in that game, and I feel like they totally did that. But they also kind of were like, well, like telling a time loop story and or trying to sort of build on these concepts that they sort of found out that they, even when they took the AAA production quality of the second wave and they sort of brought it in, they started to like realize little things and kind of some weirdness. And I think probably the most important innovation in Deathloop is kind of this really weird aside, and it's that when you do hacking in Deathloop, or you hack cameras or doors or things like that, there's no mini game. This is, I think, one of the first games where they started to decide that they didn't need the mini game, and I think that's kind of one of the big parts of the second wave, is that the second wave did a lot more mini games in their development, and I think Deathloop is when they kind of finally says, like, we don't need this hacking mini game. We can just show you, like, what's going on, and we're just going to keep you into that core game loop of the immersive sim experience. This sort of idea, I think, really comes into sort of the third wave, and it's kind of funny because, like, Harvey Smith, one of the developers of Deathloop, Prey, and Dishonored, he was working at Arcane at the time. He also worked on the original Deus Ex in the first wave. What Harvey Smith sort of predicted, kind of famously, is that like indies were going to take over. What happened was kind of just that. You started to see games like Cruelty Squad and Control Alt Ego. There's been some other ones, and in an interesting way, this is sort of the fans sort of taking back the reins of what an immersive sim is. So you have Parapedia, Sorceress, I think it is. You have a few of these like other smaller developers totally outside the AAA space coming in and deciding we're going to make an immersive sim. The concept to all of this, they are bringing all of these kind of from seeing them in the AAA space, and then the indies are sort of bringing their own sort of, the amateur eye, I think is maybe what it's called, but they're bringing in this different definition of immersive sim and different reaction to these values. And I probably have explored the least of the third wave yet. I mean, there's just a lot of indie games coming out, and I am probably spending too much time making games instead of playing them, which is a weird thing to say, but I think that can be a true statement. And I think the indie wave is... So I think the indie wave is going to be interesting, because there's this sort of effect where most players, most people who play video games, don't really play indie games. Indie games are really... they're like the independent film world, right? Most people are going to see the big budget Marvel movie AAA, stuff. But if you want to really be a fan, if you really want to be like into games, the capital G gamer, if you will, instead of becoming a sort of genre or like franchise cultist, you have to become sage of the genre. And to become this, you have to start looking at the esoteric indie films, or in this case, the esoteric indie games. You have to like go to itch.io and like play games. These are very like outside the norm sort of angles. But if you really want to be into it, if you really want to be following where the next steps are going to be, it's going to be in these games. It's going to be in indie. And I think it's going to be interesting because at some point, AAA is going to come back to the immersive sim. I think you're going to have different studios. You're going to have studios that came out of this, or this indie immersive sim sort of wave, this third wave, and they're going to build up and become AAA. I think you're going to have established AAAs that are going to try to come into the immersive sim. And I think there's going to be a little bit of a clash, and there's going to be a little bit of an interesting point where you will probably have the larger, more established companies taking this more top-down approach to what an immersive sim should be, and maybe not even looking at the indie immersive sims. And then you're going to have the indies kind of coming out, and they're going to have, I think, either fresher ideas, but maybe not necessarily have... They're going to have fresher ideas, but they're not going to have the same understanding. They're going to have their own sort of take on what an immersive sim is. I think that probably not this year, or it might take 5 years or so for the indie immersive sim and the AAA immersive sim to really come to a head. I think when you see those two games come together, and I don't necessarily think it'll be an actual direct clash. It'll be like one of those things where we're playing a sort of game and like sort of seeing the style, and we might be able to say like, oh, this immersive sim feels a little more indie, and this immersive sim feels a little more AAA. And there might be some that just really walk the line, and I think it's going to be also interesting because Warren Spector, who's been one of the earlier guys who worked on immersive sim, he's also one of the older guys, and at some point, like, the immersive sim genre is going to exist sort of without him. he's probably going to retire. Like he's probably going to retire honestly after his current few projects, or at least like try to. It's hard to retire. It's hard to sort of give up, something you've done your whole life. But I think when he does that and sort of like hands over the reins, I think he'll be happy because he won't have to do all that work anymore and he'll just get to play stuff. But I think there'll also be like a moment when people kind of have to start to work without sort of the guidance of not only him but other people in the immersive sim genre, the people that established it. And I think in the fourth wave that's going to happen in probably the next 7 to 10 years, you're going to have to start to see that. And there might be some new luminaries that come out that are the big voices in what an immersive sim is. I think you're also going to see too, like the one thing that really changed a lot is in the second wave and in the first wave, media was very top down. It was still very much, you had like magazines and publications talking about why immersive sims are cool. And now it's really democratized and it's become sort of more indie. You have a lot more either YouTubers or bloggers or just individuals, people posting on various social media websites. It's a much more open sort of platform for discussing these questions and evangelizing these types of games. In some ways, like this podcast itself is a part of that. Is a part of that shift from the second wave to like the third wave, from like the fan perspective. So I hope the sort of idea and the concept of like the three waves sort of makes sense. I hope that I hope the predictions I made stay at least somewhat true, or at the very least stay interesting. And that's really all I really wanted to say about